Hi, everybody. Let's go ahead and kick off. Today, we're going to talk about the upcoming changes in the heat network market, particularly to do with regulations, to do with our regulator coming into post. The implications are really big for everybody who works in heat networks, from designers to installers and operators. So we're going to dig into that today. Probably going to stick to about 30 minutes if we can, and then hold some time at the end for questions if you got them. So how are we doing questions? They drop them into the, okay, cool. Just drop them into the usual place. Great. So a little bit of background before we, next slide, please. A little bit of background before we kick off. We are Fury Systems. We provide technology, so electronics and hardware that make heat and cooling networks more transparent, lower cost, and lower carbon. We've been doing that for more than 10 years in our space. We've got about 45 people in our growing team, and we have delivered more than 45,000 devices, so installed or being installed, in homes and small commercial units across the UK. So we're involved in, I think, more than 300 heat networks across the piece. We've got our product suite down there below, which I'm not really going to dwell on. I'll tell you a little bit more about how what we do fits into the context of regulatory changes a little bit later. So next slide, please. Okay, so before we talk about what's going to change, let's talk about where we are now, right? So pick out some of the key features in the regulatory landscape as it stands today. The first one is the heat network metering and billing regs, been with us since 2014. And the big change that this brought was an obligation to, in most cases, to meter and then to charge people for their consumption. This was the UK's expression of part of the Energy Efficiency Directive out of Europe. So the whole point of this was to give people more control over how much they're consuming and what they're going to pay for it, right? So this connection between metered data, consumption data, and the amount that they pay. That was a big step forward. Since that came into force, meters have been required in new builds and in significant interventions in retrofit. The last update to these was in 2019. I think one of the criticisms of this, it's got loads of really good features baked into it, but one of the criticisms of this would be it's not necessarily been enforced very strongly, right? I think over time, the adherence to this hasn't been as strict as it needed to be in order to have the benefits that everybody was looking for. So that's the heat network reg, CP1 2020. So we had a previous incarnation of CP1, and then 2020 came along. It is super comprehensive. If you've been through it, it talks about how to design, build, manage. It's not a legal requirement, right? It's not, strictly speaking, regulation. You've probably seen it written into lots of specifications, right? This design shall, in the lightest touch form, it'll say something like this design shall conform to CP1. It's a really broad document, so that's not always a useful way of phrasing it, but there are really useful specifics in there. This was the first time that we had minimum standards. So even if this is a voluntary set of rules, there are minimum standards in there that are very difficult for consultants or other members of the project team to back away from, because it's got CIBSI's name on it alongside the ADE. In there, it does talk about data and performance monitoring, which is a theme that we're going to touch on repeatedly as we're working through this and talking about regulation. And the minimum requirement is that you've got an automatic meter reading system, and it can record, transmit, and store things like not just the meter reading of kilowatt hours, right? So not just the thing that you need to read and then bill somebody, but also the stuff that you need in order to get a better view of how the underlying system is performing, the heat network is performing. So stuff like flow temp, return temp, flow rate, instantaneous load in kilowatts. Says you got to do that you got to be able to do that 30-minutely. And then best practice in there is 5-minutely. That's been a huge step forward, but it has been difficult to prove that you're compliant, right? If somebody's just said, be compliant with this, that can be pretty hard with CP1. So we'll come back to the role that CP1 is playing behind the upcoming regs. A third thing to point out is starting to see things like the London Plan policy for BC. That is a requirement, and we're starting to see this come through in planning permissions, where it says you will monitor the actual performance of the energy systems on your site for 5 years after defects and liability ends, and you'll report these up. And if they don't show that the site is performing in line with the original expectations, then you'll have to put together a remediation plan, and we'll inspect that, and so on. It's not 100% clear. While this has got, it's not optional if it comes through in your planning in your conditions for building a site. It's not entirely clear what the ultimate sanction is, whether it would go as far as pulling your planning permission while you're in an operation. So it's an important step forward, and we do see this in the market. It tends to be in particular places like in London, although other planning authorities outside of London are also looking at implementing something similar. A fourth one to highlight is Heat Trust. So Heat Trust is the stakeholder-led customer protection scheme for heat networks. And it was, it had been in design, but then started about 7 years ago. And it's all about ensuring that customers on heat networks have the same or similar protections as you find in the electricity and gas space, including things like recourse to an ombudsman. So a really important step forward again, but again, like CP1, it's voluntary. It's a voluntary scheme. But again, we'll come back to how that fits into the regs because it's important, important context. So shall we go on to the next slide? Super. All right. So Ofgem's coming. We had an official word, I think June 21, that Ofgem was going to be our regulator. There's a whole lot of activity going on inside DESNZ and Ofgem to ensure that they are set up and running. My expectation is that that's going to be live in Q1 2025. I think that's the date to expect. And at this point, our space has a regulator. So heating and cooling networks have a regulator. Well, okay, so fine. So what aspects is regulation going to cover? And this is lifted from Ofgem as a sort of summary of the scope that they're covering. So we've got two types of participation for operators. One is licensing and one is authorization. I'm not going to get into the distinction between those two things, other than to say that licensing brings additional rights and powers. The expectation is it would allow you to do things like access your assets, even if they're buried in public roads, for example. There will be a digital platform associated with this. More on that in one sec. That then sits over the top of these regulatory activities. Okay, so monitoring, reporting, and audit. There will be a requirement to measure and record certain things, and then report those up to the regulator on an annual basis and possibly more frequently for some data, right? So there may be this a kind of matching of frequency with the data depending on the level of risk associated with the thing that you're measuring. So that we would expect that that reporting to take place via the digital platform. Consumer protection is, we would expect it to be largely an expression of the kinds of rules that have been developed and used within heat trust, right? So there's a whole lot of learning in heat trust that we would expect to be kind of incorporated into the Ofgem approach, and there's a lot of collaboration going on between heat trust and the Ofgem team. Pricing is a new one, right? So pricing has not been part of heat trust's remit. It's not been part of anybody's remit up until now. So this is entirely new for our space. But how the heck do you regulate price in a very, very diverse market with lots of different commercial models associated? It's a real challenge. It's going to rely on technical standards to a large degree, right? Because the expectation is there's going to be a lot of tie between, is this price reasonable and is the system working well? If it's working poorly, then it's likely that the price that's coming out the other end of that system may be judged unreasonable. Metering and billing is like the metering and billing regs. I'm not going to get into that. Technical standards is taking the crucial parts of CP1 and developing them into a technical assurance scheme that measures what matters. So set out the requirements, measure what matters, and then verify outcomes. On the next slide, I'm going to tell you more about that in some detail. And then decarbonization is another aspect. So Ofgem actually sits over, they have the responsibility to ensure that heat networks are low carbon or are decarbonizing over time. In the same way that, we've all seen the charts of grid electricity decarbonizing over time, and lived through that over the last 15 years or so, and their projections on how that continues. Heat also needs to decarbonize over time, including on existing networks. Some of the functions then behind all this are, you've got audit, compliance, enforcement, and ultimately step-in, which is a super complicated area, but where you might actually have operators losing the right to operate. Digital platform. Why is that so important? Well, imagine you're Ofgem, right? Imagine that for years and years, you've been sitting over the top of the electricity and gas space. And if we stick with electricity for a sec, you are regulating 14 network operators, right? 14 DNOs. If you want to talk to them to resolve some kind of an issue, you can pick up the phone. You can probably organize a meeting and get all of them in a room. It is human, it's analog, it's very direct. But we're moving to a world, Ofgem is now stepping in to regulate a world of 14,000 or more heat network operators, right? So OBSS would say it's 14,000. We know it's more than 14,000. What the heck do you do if you're Ofgem and you're now, you now have this responsibility? Well, the only way that you can effectively regulate your space is if you are measuring digitally, ensuring that data is flowing into the regulator, and then automatically analyzing that data to identify where the risk is. And finally, once you've identified where the risk is, that's where the human eyeballs come into it, right? So that's where people then swing into action if issues arise. So as much as possible, you want to do screening based on the data that you're collecting. There's no other way to do this. And so this digital platform is the kind of interface into the regulator. We don't know exactly what this looks like yet, but there has to be this means of data flowing from the market into Ofgem and allowing Ofgem to then take action. All of that relies on digitalization as a broad approach, and specifically, you gotta meter, you gotta pull key data out. You're gonna have to pre-process and pass that up to the regulator. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technical assurance piece. Okay. The aim of the technical assurance piece is to ensure that we've got good working heat networks. That's what it's there for. And we want those heat networks to work well and reliably, because we want them to actually deliver good quality, cost-effective service to the customers. We want the assets to have a long and happy life, long and productive life, providing this heat to the customers. And we want to enable investment into the space, right? That private investment needs certainty about what it's investing into and how that's going to perform. Because if you haven't got that, then you have to price the uncertainty into your commercial model. And before you know it, the cost of capital is too high and a project isn't viable. So the technical insurance scheme underpins all these different purposes. It will, kind of like CP1, sit over all the stages of from concept design all the way through to operation and maintenance of a heat network. There's the separation of the stages, and you can see the little gateways. This is lifted from Fairheat. You can see with those arrows, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Those are the gateways where you have to have achieved something by that point before you can go into the next stage. So there's the stages as far as life cycle goes, but it's also important to point out that the technical assurance scheme is going to break up the heat network into pieces. I think one of the things that they had to grapple with early on was, what is it that's getting certified here? And I think they've broken it up into 6 pieces, right? And that's everything from the energy center to the district network to the communal network, so inside a block, to substations, right? So you might have a big substation either somewhere out on your district network or at the boundary of your block, to the customer level HIU or substation, and then the customer level heating systems on the inside. Each one is its own piece for certification. And by making it more granular, what that means is, one, you can split up the responsibility, like who's responsible for doing this piece. And the other thing that you can do is you ensure that if one dwelling isn't passing, you haven't scuppered all the other certifications for the other dwellings, because the stakes are high, right? This is regulation now. So it's very easy to imagine that if you haven't got your dwelling level certification, if you're not compliant with the regulations, probably can't let that flat. You probably can't sell that flat if you're a developer. So it's hugely important that that the certification allows as much value to be delivered as possible and homes in on where those problems are from a point of roles and responsibilities and this kind of commercial granularity. Let's go on to the next one. Thank you. So what else do we know? We know that the regs are going to be retrospective, right? They will obviously apply to new networks, but they'll also apply to existing networks. Some of those are unmetered now, and some of them are metered but maybe don't have AMR, or are metered but haven't been collecting the data, etc. So it requires existing networks to step up in some really important ways. The expectation, and this isn't 100% clear yet, but the expectation is that there's going to be a window for existing networks to become compliant. I don't think that window is going to be too big, but there should be some flexibility there on getting up to minimum standards, not just on metering, but probably on performance as well. It's also important to point out that it's all heat networks, including what's called ambient loop. So where you have a central source of thermal energy that's moving around the site at lowish temperatures, like 25 to 35 degrees flow temp. And then you've got little heat pumps in every dwelling that's then upgrading that heat, right? The source, the ultimate source of the thermal energy is the energy center, but those little heat pumps are just upgrading the temperature of that thermal energy. They are also caught, and there's been a bunch of I guess ambiguity or confusion in the space about whether or not they're in. Let's go on to the next one, please. Okay. So as I mentioned before, everybody in the value chain will be touched by this in some way. If you're a designer, you're going to have to design in a way that's compliant with the technical assurance scheme. You need to show that your design meets the requirements of regulation and the building spec. And then when the design is installed and commissioned, there's going to be a measurement against the original intent. And the expectation then is the designer has the liability for the design, right? Not whether somebody installed it outside of the design or did a poor job commissioning or whatever, but the designer has responsibility for design. The contractor then has to demonstrate that the heat network was installed and commissioned in line with the spec and the standards, so the regulation, and will demonstrate that using data, will demonstrate that using measurements in many cases. So we went back, so on the bit with the gateways, the fair heat gateways, there was one just after commissioning. So installing and commissioning, and that's the gateway where everything has to be measured. And if it's not performing in line with expectations, if it's not complying with the regs, then the work has to be remediated until it's sorted out. We already see this. We're already involved in projects where this kind of approach is used, right? Because CP1 has got something called acceptance testing in it. Best practice is to do 100% acceptance testing, and we have provided data and tools that kind of back that acceptance testing process up. We see again and again where that verification process happens, you get vastly better outcomes. This is a super important aspect of the upcoming regs. And then if you're an operator, then you're going to have to collect your data, including performance data and other things like data on outages and so on. And you're going to have to report that up to Ofgem. Now, imagine, so cast your mind forward, you're the operator of a scheme, you know that you've got a deadline for reporting your performance data up to Ofgem via the digital platform. And you also know that Ofgem's internal systems are going to be crawling over those submissions, looking for where the risk. So you want to be submitting data that shows that your network is doing a good job. And if it's not, then you need to be collecting that data and using it to make your network better, to make it compliant before you go and put your submission in. So this isn't just a matter of taking data out in order to submit it and like, okay, done now. The whole point is that it becomes part of your operation, that you're aware of how your system is working. You're ensuring that it's compliant, that it's meeting the minimum technical standards, performance standards, for example, and then you're submitting your data up to Ofgem, who should be delighted with the data that you submit. Okay. Right. I talked a little bit about this, this move, this shift for Ofgem. And I think as an organization, it's a big old shift, right? From a small number of networks and network operators to a very large number of network operators. And we know, hopefully it's clear, that digitalization, measurement, automated evaluation of data is going to have to perform a really fundamental role here. This aligns with the approach that we've taken at Guru from the beginning, right? We're more than 10 years old, and the idea from very early on in Guru's life was that heat and cooling networks needed to have their performance digitalized. The data needed to support, it needed to be actionable. People need to be able to digest that data, which sometimes those data sets are really big. They can't be digested by a human directly. So you got to do analysis on it. You got to do visualization on it to make it digestible. But it's by doing that you get you get transparency in how your system is performing. It's in doing that you can hold your supply chain to account and ensure that you're getting what you paid for, either from your subbies or from your contractor. The product suite down there at the bottom is the hardware and software that we use in order to support this digitalization offerings. There's Hub 2 on the far left-hand side, which is used for credit billing and pay-as-you-go at the dwelling and small commercial level. Hub 3 Core is the screenless version of our hardware with loads of good features baked into it, like relays that you can control remotely and the ability to connect into things like electronic HIUs. And it's also much lower CapEx in order to compete favorably with the status quo, which is usually wired and glass. Guru Pinpoint is our data visualization and analysis. It's all browser-based. If you're not already a subscriber, come and talk to us about it. Integrate is where we talk to things like electronic HIUs. We find out everything that they know, and then you can reconfigure those at a distance, meaning that you don't have to go knock on a door if you want to change how your HIU is configured. It's a really powerful way of reducing the cost of interventions because it becomes remote rather than in person. And then Verify is the tool for backing up acceptance testing. So this verification of performance just after commissioning time, particularly at the dwelling level. So all of those tools are all centered around this core idea of digitalizing performance and then being able to act on what you learn from the data that's being pulled out of the site in order to ensure that your systems are working well. I think that's our last slide. Bang on 11:30.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. So Casey, if I just fire them, is that all right? So the first question that we got in is, what impact will these regulations have on existing heat networks?
They will cover existing heat networks. It's as I mentioned earlier, it's likely that there's going to be a window to achieve a minimum level of compliance, but they will have to. So what we see now is we see clients, particularly in the housing association space, starting to allocate budgets and then look for there will be people who move in advance of the regulator taking up their post in Q1 2025, or at least that's the date I think is going to happen. There will be people who move sooner, and there will be some people who move later, but all those networks will be covered. That includes what we think is about just over 300,000 networks where there aren't any heat meters installed, right? So we've got a whole bunch of, it's difficult to quantify, but we think it's about 320,000 unmetered connections that up until now have been doing things like allocating bills according to square footage or whatever of the dwellings that are connected to that network. And it's very likely, although we don't have clarity on this yet, that those are all going to have to be metered, or at least the majority of them will, in order to be compliant with regulation. Because of this acknowledgement, this recognition on Ofgem's side that you have to do this through digitalization. That is the way that this is going to work. You can't do that. Fundamentally, you can't do that unless you've got those meters installed. So the metering aspect will apply, and a certain level of technical assurance is also expected to apply, both with some time to become compliant after the regulations come into force.
And follow-up related to that question, if existing networks do not comply, what liability does the original system designer have?
Oh, wow. I don't know the answer to that question. My expectation is that the regulations aren't going to cover the contracts of the original job, but that's purely speculating. And that it's going to be down to the operator to ensure that they are compliant. It's unlikely, I think, that operators would be able to go back and go after their designers for regulations that didn't exist back then. I just don't see that being a feasible route forward. But I'm not a lawyer, so don't take your legal advice from me.
Got 2 more questions so far, or 3 more questions. Next one is, how was the information you presented today gathered and acquired? Are you directly involved with Ofgem's work?
It's been gathered and acquired from public-facing information, right? So I am involved in Ofgem's work in that I'm involved with Heat Trust. So I chair that board. And obviously Heat Trust collaborates really closely with Ofgem and DESNZ, but all the information that we've talked about today is, it's not insider info, it's all stuff that's out in the public domain. I think what's been really helpful is that DESNZ, Ofgem, Fair Heat, GemServe, they've all been able to talk as things have been evolving. For example, at the Fair Heat events last year, was it last year? When was it?
Earlier this year.
Earlier this year, okay. Able to talk about the evolution of things like the technical assurance scheme. So there is information that's out there. I think it's really important, though, to emphasize that some of this is still crystallizing. There's expected to be a consultation later in the summer. Is that in Westminster speak, I guess? There's expected to be a consultation later in the summer about Ofgem's approach. And hopefully what they're going to be able to do is say what their kind of starting position is and then ask for feedback. That process still has to run. But there's a whole lot of information that's out there now. It's really clear that the broad direction that regulation is heading. The folks who are already starting to take comfort from that fact are people like large investment funds. So in the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen at least $2.5 billion in investor funds come into the UK looking for projects to execute, and some of these are already putting pipes in the ground. So there's enough clarity around regulation so far to bring the risk level, the uncertainty levels right down. There is more that still needs to be finalized. But all the stuff we've talked about today is public.
There's a question which I think you've already answered in that, but will the regulation document be subject to consultation?
Right, yeah.
And more questions coming in. The next one, have any effective heat metering systems been developed for low ambient loops yet? Yes,
is the short answer. So you get a couple of challenges on ambient loop. You get the potential for high flow rates and low delta T, so low difference between flow and return. And I think there's been some concern in the past about ensuring that you can accurately measure those low delta Ts, but that's overcomable. And the other thing is that on ambient loop, you sometimes have to measure both heating and cooling, right? Because they're often dual mode systems. And there's some challenges around that, not insurmountable. I mean, we've already got at Guru anyway, we've already got examples of this up and running, and it's working well. This idea that you're going to use meter data in order to assess the performance at different points on your system is absolutely crucial for ambient loop networks as well, right? You have to be able to recover this energy performance data from the system and understand how well it's working. Is it delivering on the promise? If not, then it needs to be remediated. Now, in the case of ambient loop systems, you also might be interested in the electricity that's being used, right? Because you might want to be calculating something called an SPF, which is like a measure of efficiency in operation for a heat pump. And to do that, you need the heat and you need the electricity. I haven't heard that electricity is going to be required, but I would expect the thermal energy metering to be required, including the aspects that are to do with energy performance, not just kilowatt hours.
Next question, what metrics do you envisage will be used to validate the technical assurance for stages 2 to 3.2 design? Will these need to be proven before the project can progress beyond design?
So without commenting on the particular networks, because I'm not your person and I don't think that's in the public domain, the important thing is to show that the design is capable of fulfilling the requirements, right? So the not just the metrics, but the minimum level of performance for those metrics will be laid out up front, and then the design will need to be assessed against those requirements. Once that's done, that's the first hurdle cleared for the designer, and then the next thing that needs to happen is that in installation and commissioning, that it's then delivering on the design promise. So it may be that some things only come to light later, and I think if you're a designer, you're going to be designing to make sure that it's good and robust and then capable of getting through those stages. But no, I wouldn't comment on the particular metrics.
And two more questions at the moment. Will design of on-site networks be subject to Ofgem review and approval during design stage?
The technical assurance scheme, which is part of regulation, will cover the design, right? And there are gateways along the way where it's likely that an independent third party that may or may not be somebody in Ofgem, I don't think that's clarified yet, is actually checking things off at particular stages. So it's very likely that along with the technical assurance scheme, there will be some way of having the assessors who are capable of, at the points, particularly the points of those gateways, then making a judgment as to whether the regs have been met.
I was about to say final question, but there's another one now. Okay, next question. Do you have any more information on the expected pricing model Ofgem will be using? Will there be a strict methodology to follow, both a heat unit rate tariff and a daily standing charge? And what costs are allowable in each element? Okay, so this is all being worked on now. I think it's Carbon Trust who's doing that work. That's not, as far as I know, that's not been formalized. What do we know about how it's going to have to work? Well, it's going to have to work in different commercial structures. So, for example, you're going to have pricing is going to have to work in a non-profit making direct heat operator relationship between landlord and resident, just like we have now for, say, housing associations who operate their own heat networks. They don't make a profit on that. But you need to ensure that that the system is working well in order to deliver a reasonable price. It's very difficult to regulate price when everybody's procuring their input fuels at different prices, possibly depending on their purchase power, right? So it's not just a question of saying we're going to put a cap on it. We're not expecting any cap. We're expecting a connection between the level of performance from the network and the way the price is regulated. There will be other
commercial structures where there is profit making, right? There might be an energy service company in the middle of that relationship between the landlord and the tenant. They're there, they can make a profit in that position. It may be that the reasonableness of that profit is judged, but again, you'd still expect it to be underpinned by minimum standards of performance, so that the fairness of it starts with the network working well.
And the last question for now, will the regulations bring in requirements for post-commissioning product support, minimum warranty periods, etc.?
Unclear is the short answer on that one. Don't yet know the answer.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we're good. We'd like to wrap up.
Fab. Okay. So thanks very much for attending. Very happy for you to get in touch afterwards if there are other aspects that you'd like to talk through. If you don't already work with us and you would like to, obviously, please get in touch. We'd be delighted. The really important thing to take away from this is that the preparation for regulation starts now. We know enough about what's coming for people to start planning. And again, that digitalization is at the heart of what's coming down the track. So thanks very much for attending.